There we go. The Mississippi River Network is thrilled to host research ecologist Dr. Jeff Houser and wildlife refuge manager Ed Britton for today's special webinar, Restoring Our River, exploring 30 years of upper Mississippi River science and restoration. My name is Michael Anderson. I am the Director of Outreach and Education for the Mississippi River Network, and I'm grateful to be in virtual community with you all today. I'm joined by the rest of MRN, or the Mississippi River Network's tiny but mighty staff team, our Executive Director, Kelly McGinnis, and Development Manager, Gretchen Hagel. Before I introduce today's program, I'll just share a little bit of background on our organization. So the Mississippi River Network is a diverse coalition of over 70 organizations and businesses that are working together to protect the people, land, water, and wildlife of our nation's most iconic waterway, the mighty Mississippi. Founded in 2005, the network has grown into a powerful collaboration of people and organizations from the river's headwaters in Minnesota down through Louisiana to where it drains into the Gulf of Mexico. The network implements One Mississippi, the only public grassroots education, engagement, and advocacy program covering the entire Mississippi River. Since 2009, One Mississippi has grown a community of over 20,000 river citizens and inspired countless actions. From armchairs to wading boots, river citizens protect the river by speaking up on its behalf and caring for it in simple ways that make a big difference. Together, we are protecting the Mississippi now and for future generations. When looking at today's registration list, I noticed that we have both MRN members and river citizens represented, as well as other audiences we engage with, like the press and media outlets, federal and state agencies, and other decision makers. Thank you all for being a part of this community that cares for the river. It certainly takes all of us. In case you weren't before, everyone who registered for today's event is now part of our river citizen community. Be on the lookout for upcoming emails with important updates and exciting opportunities, including initiatives like the Mississippi River Network's River Days of Action. So today's event is part of River Days of Action, which takes place from June 1st to June 15th. This year, nearly 50 MRN members, partners, and community groups are hosting 30 plus events in person across the Mississippi River Basin and online, like today's special webinar. On the River Days webpage, you can find more events and ways to make a difference, including our 10 actions to create a healthier Mississippi River. I will share a few links in the chat when I'm done with my intro here. River Days of Action is possible thanks to the generous support of our sponsors, the Walton Family Foundation, Bell's Brewery, Bass Pro Shops, and Cabela's Outdoor Fund. We also count on your support. Participating in most River Days of Action events is free, but your support helps cover program costs and other work to protect the people, land, water, and wildlife of the Mississippi River. I will share a donation link in the chat for you to learn more. It'll also be in a follow-up email. And now on to our program. The Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program, often called UMRR, is one of the most celebrated and impactful environmental monitoring and restoration programs in the world. In today's webinar, our presenters will provide an overview of the program's work, which is done in collaboration with federal and state partners, including, but not all, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Upper Mississippi River State Department of Natural Resources, and NGOs like the Upper Mississippi River Basin Association and the Mississippi River Network. Please note that we have asked our presenters to provide what could be a week-long workshop of information into about a 45-minute webinar. We will not be able to cover everything, but we know that you will leave here having learned something new and inspired to get further involved. So let me introduce our presenters and then I'll pass it over to them. Dr. Jeff Houser is an esteemed research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey based at the Upper Midwest Environmental Sciences Center in La Crosse, Wisconsin. As a dedicated scientific leader, Dr. Houser spearheads the long-term resource monitoring element within the Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program. Jeff will share more about the Upper Mississippi River system, including the status and trends following 30 years of scientific monitoring. The research provided by the long-term resource monitoring team provides critical information for the other half of UMRR's program's work, the habitat rehabilitation and enhancement projects. That's where Ed Britton, with his 47 years of experience with National Wildlife Refuges, will continue the presentation, sharing on the ground / on the water habitat and ecosystem restoration strategies and stories from the Big River. Ed is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife and Fish Refuge Savannah District Refuge Manager. All right, let's get into it. Jeff, please take us away.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Sounding great.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And thank you, Michael, for that introduction. I've been working on the Upper Mississippi River since about 2003. And today I want to do three basic things. I want to give you a brief introduction to the Upper Mississippi River system for those of you who might be less familiar with it. I'd like to share some of the main things we've learned from the river from about 25 years of long-term monitoring, and give you a little bit of background and information on how those data are collected and who collects it and analyzes it. Next slide. Okay, so the Upper Mississippi River system is a large river and floodplain ecosystem. If you look at the map to the right there, the entirety of the Upper Mississippi River system is shown. That includes both the Upper Mississippi River upstream of the Ohio River and the Illinois River. The river is often described as having four parts. Each of those four parts is a different color in that map. So the red is the upper impounded reach. The green is the lower impounded reach. The purple is what's called the unimpounded reach below the lost lock and dam. And the Illinois River is shown there in gold. And I'll be discussing some information from each of these reaches in the presentation today. The Mississippi River serves a variety of roles and is a resource for a variety of human uses. This includes, it's an important ecosystem in its own right. It provides habitat for lots of plants, fish, and wildlife. It contains multiple fish and wildlife refuges, which you'll hear some more about in a minute. It's an important place for outdoor recreation. It's also a critical navigation corridor for the nation's economy. And its basin is dominated by agriculture, which you can see here in this map. All the yellow area is agriculture, and that preponderance of agriculture affects both how the river is used. Much of the navigation is moving crops downstream or fertilizer upstream. It also affects the river through inputs of sediment and nutrients. We'll talk some more about that in a minute. Next slide. And just to give you a bit more information about the variety of animals and creatures you can find in the river, I've just got a bunch of examples here. There's over 140 species of fish, a lot of different mussels and reptiles and amphibians. Next slide. There's also many different birds and waterfowl that rely on the river in a variety of ways. About 40% of the waterfowl in the US that migrate use the Mississippi River Flyway for that, and about half the world's canvasback ducks stage on the refuge. So very important ecosystem. And I want to now, next slide, talk a little bit about how the need for a long-term monitoring program on the river sort of was initially recognized. There's all these different uses. They all provide different stressors on the system that contributed to this need for a long-term monitoring program. But this need was articulated originally in a 1982 document called the Master Plan for Management of the Upper Mississippi River. And this slide summarizes how that document described the situation, that the Upper Mississippi River system is a complex ecosystem and navigation system. It faces complex challenges due to the multiple uses it supports. And there are many agencies and organizations whose mission includes management or restoration of the river. But there was an acute lack of information and inadequate communication among the different agencies that were responsible. So one of the basic needs identified out of that report for successfully managing and restoring the upper Mississippi River was a large-scale natural resource monitoring program. And as a result, we have what is now the LTRM, Long-Term Resource Monitoring element of the Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about some details about that at the end of the presentation, but right now I want to actually get into some of the things we've learned from more than 25 years of studying the river. So, going to spend the next few minutes talking about things we've learned about the river system. Most of what I'm going to share with you today is from a report we published in 2022 called the Ecological Status and Trends of the Upper Mississippi and Illinois Rivers. Michael will provide a link to that at some point, as well as in the follow-up materials. But the main purpose of this report was to answer a couple questions. How is the river doing, and where and how has it changed? And toward that end, the report provides detailed quantitative assessment of long-term trends and current status of about 40 indicators of ecosystem health and resilience. And so for the next little bit in this presentation, I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of a small number of the major findings from that report. Next slide. Okay, so one of the fundamental things that's changed in the river is how much water is in it, how often. Most of the indicators of river flow and river level have increased in most parts of the river. So what you're seeing in the table here is the results from analysis of data from a USGS gauge in each of the 4 river reaches in that map to the right. The little crosshatch circle is where the gauge is for each. So the red circle, the red in the red section, that's the upper impounded reach. Green is the lower impounded reach. The unimpounded reaches in purple, and the Illinois River in gold. So, and the indicators we're looking at here is the maximum river flow, how that's changed over time, the average river flow, the minimum river flow, and how long those high flow periods last. And you can see that for all of those indicators in most of those areas, there's been a long-term increase, and nowhere has there been a decline. And the river flow is a fundamental aspect of the river. Anybody who spent much time on it is probably aware of that. It affects things like the movement of sediments, so where is sediment deposited, where's it getting shallower, where's it getting deeper. As you have more water in the river, you have more exchange between off-channel areas, between the main channel and off-channel areas. So that affects how fast the water is moving in those off-channel areas, which affects conditions for vegetation. It affects how much nutrients and sediment are transported into those backwaters. It affects the water temperature and the amount of dissolved oxygen. So these are all things that sort of affect how suitable those habitats are for various creatures, and they're changing over time as flow increases. Another consequence of that is the next slide. We have less floodplain forest. There's been a long-term decline in floodplain forest because floodplain forests can withstand a certain amount of having their roots in the lower part of the trees inundated, but as those periods get more frequent and longer, it does increase forest mortality. And so the way we've looked at this is we collect aerial imagery every 10 years. So we have some from 1990, 2000, and 2010 that was included in this analysis. We're just recently finished up the analysis of 2020. But from 1989 to 2010, you can see sort of the percentage change in the amount of floodplain forest along the river. And I guess I wanted to explain a couple things about this. Floodplain forests have always been dynamic through time. Trees die, areas in forests die, younger trees grow, and there's sort of a successional pattern that occurs. And the increase in discharge has increased forest mortality, but interacting with that has been the appearance and increase in a number of invasive herbaceous species, particularly things like reed canary grass in the upper part of the river and Japanese hops a little further south. These are things that when trees die can move quickly into that area, grow very quickly, and make it difficult for trees to reestablish. So the combined effects of these higher flows and invasive species are working to cause this long-term decline in floodplain forest. Okay, so next thing I wanted to talk about here is how some of the off-channel and backwater areas are changing over time. We've seen substantial input of sediment into these backwaters, and it does two things. One, it creates sort of additional floodplain and land where there used to be water, and it also makes those areas shallower. So you can see a couple examples in the 4-panel figure to your left there of the kinds of places where sediment tends to accumulate, where side channels or tributary channels flow into backwaters. Their velocity slows down, the material in the water settles out. And that can create shallow areas or build sand flats and future floodplain. And you can see examples of both there to the right. You can see shallow water where sediment has accumulated. And so why does this matter? This sedimentation changes the kind of habitats that are there and what they're used by. As you have a reduced volume and depth of water under the ice in the wintertime, it can reduce the habitat suitability for some winter fishes, some fishes, particularly centarchids, so bluegill, largemouth bass, the crappie, those sorts of things. These fish need off-channel areas where the water isn't moving very much, but they need them to be deep enough that there's enough oxygen in that water to last through the winter under the ice. So as the backwaters get shallower, they're less suitable for that, for those species. Changes in depth also affect what vegetation can grow there. But it's also the case that as these new land areas form, they create often sandy habitat that's ideal for some other species. So some shorebirds and waterbirds and early successional tree species like willows and cottonwoods. So all of this is part of a river that is dynamic and it's changing through time. And depending on how you in particular enjoy the river, you then will view some of those changes as improvements and others not so much. But the river continues to change. So next slide, please. Okay, so the river still has too much nitrogen and phosphorus in it. Nitrogen and phosphorus are important for two reasons. They are needed by plants and algae to grow. If there's no nitrogen and phosphorus, those can't grow at all. But when you have too much of nitrogen and phosphorus, you get too much of the plants. And you can see some examples of that in these pictures. In addition to sort of the short-term aesthetic effects, as these overabundance of plants and algae die, they decompose, which uses up oxygen, so they can create low oxygen conditions. So too much nutrients, too many plants creates issues. But it is the case that since the 50s and 60s, the water quality overall and nitrogen and phosphorus have improved substantially because of the Clean Water Act primarily. And the Clean Water Act was very good at reducing the inputs of nutrients and other contaminants into the river from industrial sources and sewage treatment plants, which were important sources historically. It doesn't address inputs from farm fields and urban and suburban lawns, which is where most of the nutrients come from today. There is some good news from 1994 through 2018 when we did this for the data we analyzed. There was widespread decline in phosphorus across the various portions of the reach we study, including some of the tributaries. And some of this was due, especially in the upper part of the river, there was a major improvement to the Twin Cities metro sewage treatment plant that substantially increased the amount of phosphorus it removed and dramatically increased how much was coming in. So that was one thing that changed, but also likely smaller sewage treatment plants and changes in land use practices have contributed to that. We haven't seen a similar change in nitrogen. Nitrogen concentrations actually in a number of places have gone up. The exception is the Illinois River, where we have seen a decline there. So there's still too much nutrients in the river. For phosphorus, at least, we've seen an encouraging trend. And we'll have to sort of watch to see how that changes into the future. Next slide. This is one of the things that's changed most dramatically in the river over the last 25 years is there's been a substantial increase in water clarity. Water clarity is a fundamental characteristic of aquatic ecosystems. It's one of the primary determinants of where vegetation can grow and where it can't because it needs enough light to be able to grow. It's also important for fish that rely on sight for catching prey or finding their food. And it affects filter feeding animals like freshwater mussels. in the upper Mississippi River system, water clarity is primarily controlled by how much material is suspended in the water column. And that's largely a factor of what comes in from the tributaries, and in some of the impounded areas upstream of the locks and dams where it's relatively shallow, the murkiness of the water can be due to the resuspension of sediment in those areas. So anyway, you can see a few things related to that on this slide. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see the confluence of the St. Croix River coming in from the left, which flows through a largely forested area, and the upper Mississippi there on the right, which this is just downstream from the Minnesota River. Probably after a pretty big rain event, a lot of sediment comes in from the Minnesota River because of the abundance of agriculture in its watershed. So anyway, there's some of the sources. You can see on this image on the left, an area that to the left on that figure is more murky, to the right is clearer. That area to the right is water coming out of a vegetation bed. Vegetation tends to slow water down, allow the particles to settle out of it, producing clearer water. And that feedback will be important here in just a minute. But like I said, this is something that's increased substantially. Water clarity, total suspended solids has gone down quite a lot. Water clarity has increased. Related to that, next slide, is there's been a substantial increase in the submersed aquatic vegetation, that's under the water, especially as you go upstream from navigation pool 13 near Bellevue, Iowa, is where most of this increase has been observed. And then next slide. So in addition to the submersed vegetation, an emergent vegetation that has really become much more abundant in the last few years is wild rice, particularly again upriver from pool 13, although it's now growing more commonly in pool 13 as of this year and maybe last year. But you can see that this is a very dense, this is a plant that grows very dense stands and is going to change how and where the water flows and where sediment accumulates, and affect the kinds of habitats that exist and their distribution on the river. So this is a big structural change that has really occurred in the last few years. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I want to tie a few of these pieces together into sort of the story of water clarity and vegetation as we best understand it. There was a major decline in aquatic vegetation in the late 1980s for reasons that we don't really understand. And that low vegetation condition persisted until the early 2000s, when mid 2000s, when there was a period of a couple really low discharge, really low river flow years, 2006, 7, and 9 particularly. And there was an associated higher water clarity with that and reduced water velocity. And we saw, especially in navigation pool 8 and navigation pool 4, the beginning of a return of vegetation occurring at the same time as that initial increase in vegetation was a substantial decline in common carp. And you can see a picture of what common carp can do over to the right there. They tend to disturb the bottom, which resuspends sediment and also can disturb the plants. So their decline was also happening. And so what we think has happened then is we've seen an initial increase in vegetation. As that vegetation has increased, it's created clearer water in those vegetation beds and downstream of those vegetation beds, which has encouraged further vegetation increases. And there's a feedback there. And also contributing to that was this decline in common carp, reducing sediment resuspension and damage to veg. And as a result, there has been over the last 20 years, a major increase in aquatic vegetation associated with that major increase in water clarity. Okay, next slide. Okay, so another major change in the river, especially for those of you who are a little further south, especially below Lock and Dam 19, has been the proliferation of invasive carps. You can see a picture of what they like to do here. This has had a whole bunch of effects on the ecosystem and the use of the ecosystem, because these fish get really big and their alarm response when a boat goes by is to jump out of the water. And so that creates issues in and of itself. And I think you have a video you can show of what this looks like. This is an older video, but it gives you an idea of abundance and what it's like to be in the river when you're around a lot of them. In addition to this sort of physical change, there's been a number of ecological changes associated with their proliferation, as native filter feeding species that compete with these invasive carps have declined. There's also been declines in sport fish associated with the proliferation of these. An overall decline in some of the other aspects of the native fish community, and a variety of other changes in the ecosystem as these fish have become really abundant. As I said, their high abundance is mostly restricted below Lock and Dam 19, but they've been found as far as Pool 2 and the Twin Cities area. They just don't tend to be, they haven't achieved anywhere near the kind of abundance they have in the lower river. Next slide. Okay, I want to just talk a little bit more about two other changes in the fish community that have happened since 1994. The first one I'm going to talk about is what are called lentic fishes. This is a general name for a group of fish that most of you are probably familiar with. It's the things like bluegill and sunfish and bass that prefer still water. There's been an increase in these fishes in a variety of the places we collect data. Pool 4 near Lake City, Minnesota, Pool 8 near La Crosse, Wisconsin, especially. And in those areas, the increase in those fish is pretty tightly associated with that increase in vegetation I was talking about a few minutes ago. The forage fish are important in the ecosystem because they are in the middle of the food web. So they are what tend to eat algae and small invertebrates, and then feed larger fish. And we've seen some substantial declines in forage fish in a variety of parts of the river system. In some of these areas, we don't really know why. In the open river and LaGrange, the LaGrange is on the Illinois River in particular, that may be associated with the strong increase in invasive carps. Okay, next slide. So how do we know all this? I just presented a whole lot of information, and I'm just going to tell you very briefly where all that information came from. It came from the hard work of a lot of people over a long period of time. Next slide. And most of those people were a part of what Michael introduced at the beginning, the Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program. This is an Army Corps of Engineers program that functions as an interagency partnership that includes USGS, who provides scientific leadership for the science and monitoring, Fish and Wildlife Service, which has a major role in the restoration, which Ed's going to talk about next. Also EPA, USDA, and the 5 Upper Mississippi River Basin states, so Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri are all part of this program. And the program has 2 major elements. All the stuff I just told you about is part of the long-term resource monitoring element, which I'll talk to you about just a little bit more in the next slide. The other portion is the habitat rehabilitation enhancement projects, which you'll hear more about in the next presentation. Next slide. So the long-term resource monitoring, you'll recognize some of these pool names from some of the earlier slides. We are actively collecting long-term data in 6 study reaches across the Upper Mississippi River, and 5 study reaches on the Upper Mississippi and 1 study reach on the Illinois River. Within each of those study reaches every year, a set of water quality, aquatic vegetation, and fish data are collected. In addition to that data, we have data on the overall depth distribution or bathymetry, how deep the river is, maps of that depth for the entire system, as well as the elevations of the floodplain. And we have land cover data, which I referenced earlier, from 10-year increments. And that land cover data is derived from aerial photos that are converted into digital maps of different kinds of vegetation, so we can see how the vegetation is changing over time. There's a ton more information about this out there. If you just do an internet search, I think for UMRR LTRM, it'll take you there. But Michael, I think, is also going to put some links directly to the main pages. Next slide. Just a little bit more information about the data that's collected. First of all, just to give you an idea of the amount of data that are collected, this map over here is Pool 13. It's all the water quality sites that are sampled during one seasonal sampling episode. So it's about 135 to 150 sites, depending on which pool you're in, that's sampled over a 2-week period, 4 times a year. There's similar distributions for vegetation and fish. You can see the number of sites that are visited for each of those in the slide. Next slide. So I want to thoroughly acknowledge the substantial and critical contribution of the state-operated field stations. Each of those pools are monitored by staff from the associated natural resource, or in the case of Illinois, Natural History Survey agency. Those are the folks who do all the data collection. They also do a fair amount of analysis of the data and presenting those results in papers and presentations. And you can see from the slide, they're out in all sorts of weather and pandemic conditions, and they're sort of the guts of the program. In addition to that, next slide, we have a group of scientists at the USGS Upper Midwest Environmental Sciences Center that are shown here. You can see the water quality lab folks in the lower right, and then scientists from a diverse area of expertise across the rest of the slide. Next slide. Okay, so we have a website. It is starting to look a little dated and aged, but it contains a ton of good information. If you go to this website, you can see under components, there's links to fish, aquatic vegetation, water quality. If you go to any of those links, you'll have the opportunity to learn more about that component. You can download the raw data, and there is a way to make simple graphs of the parts of the data you are particularly interested in seeing. And so next slide. If you go to that website and fiddle around with the data viewing application there, you can make graphs of what's happened with suspended solids, what we have in the upper left, what's happened with bluegill in the bottom center, what's happened with vegetation in the upper right, and you can look at that across all the study reaches. So there's a lot of raw data, as well as summarized data, and a list of all the relevant publications can be found on that website too. Next slide. Okay, so just to wrap up, the long-term data across a wide portion of the Upper Mississippi River shows how diverse it is and how it continues to change. We've learned a lot about where, when, and how the river is changing, and this understanding is important in supporting many of the previous ongoing and planned river habitat rehabilitation projects, a few of which you're going to hear about in the next presentation. And that's all for me. So we can, I think, switch it over to Ed now.
Hey, good afternoon, folks. So I am on the Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife and Fish Refuge. We just are celebrating our 100-year anniversary. Saturday, we had a huge event, and the next few weeks, we've still got them coming. But extremely important for the Upper Mississippi River. We've been designated a wetland of international importance, a globally important bird area. And I grew up on the lower Mississippi, and I can tell you folks that it is a completely different river down there, totally different. And yeah, not only from a wildlife diversity standpoint, from a recreational standpoint, from a human standpoint. Next one, please. So there are 570 national wildlife refuges nationwide, and includes over 147 million acres. But we're very unique. We are the longest continuous national wildlife refuge in the lower 48 states, 261 miles, 244,000 acres in the states of Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. On the upper right, we border 72 cities as we come down. This is actually Pool 8 in La Crosse. And in the lower part, that's Pool 9. And because the refuge is here, we have many backwater areas of diversity. You do not see that on the lower river. You just do not see that. It's a straight channel with levees on both sides, a very different river. Next one. So because we're so long, we're divided up into administrative districts. So my office takes care of areas in pools 12, 13, and 14. So we have 80 river miles stretching from Dubuque, Iowa, down to about the Quad Cities, 64,000 acres. This is one of the backwater areas we have called our Lost Mound unit in Upper Pool 13. Next slide. So many of the environmental challenges that Jeff's been talking about, we have a tremendous partnership with the long-term resource monitoring folks. And, they've been monitoring sedimentation. This is the upper lake of Beaver Island, located in Clinton, Iowa, down in Pool 14. And this was one of our UMRR projects that I'll be talking about a little bit later. But you can see the amount of sedimentation that's coming in. The channel that you see there to the right is coming in. And the flow, once it hits that open area, it dumps out all that sediment in the backwaters. And I talked to many of the residents here, and 30 to 40 years ago, they talked about this being 10 feet deep back here in these backwaters. And this is one of many lakes that's protected inside of Beaver Island itself. So continuing problem that we're seeing more and more with is extreme floods. Next slide, please. Other problems we're looking at on the river, particularly with these extremes that we're seeing, is shoreline island erosion, significant erosion. And it seems like every time we get a high flood event that lasts for a while, we have continuous days of 30 to 40 mile-an-hour winds. And when you get wind and wave action with that amount of wind, this is what you see. And of course, when you have trees right along the shoreline, they have a very shallow root system. They don't have to be that deep to get water. So this is what we're seeing continuously along any areas where there are islands or peninsulas that come out along the main river channel in the backwater areas. Next. The other thing that we're seeing is this extensive mortality. In 2019, here in the areas of pools 12, 13, and 14, we had extreme floods that were 10 feet above normal for 90 days. And you can actually see the water level on those trees. And disappointingly, thousands of trees died. Many areas like this, as far as the eye can see, all of the trees are dead. And we're struggling with that. How do we recover from that? Next slide. And as Jeff mentioned, this is what we're seeing, more and more new invasive species. These have been around 10 years or more. Jeff talked about the Japanese hops, the burr cucumber, but this is actually down on Grant Island in Pool 14, the picture. And this is what these plants do. They will climb up the trees. Dead trees they love because there's open sunshine, but they'll climb up live trees and they'll kill those trees. If you're from the South a little bit, you might be familiar with kudzu, and this is very familiar to kudzu. But this, in addition to all the tree mortality, invasive species, none of our native trees can reestablish because they can't make it to the ground. Next slide. So to address these problems, the UMRR, the Habitat Rehabilitation Enhancement Program, it came around in 1986, and we have been so fortunate. My 47-year career, I've never been associated with anything like this partnership on federal property, and particularly on large river systems like this. But just to show you how it has improved over the time, when it was initially authorized in 86, 33 million. And that had to be spread between the three Corps of Engineer districts. So St. Paul, Rock Island, and St. Louis would take their share of that. It was raised to 50 million in 2020, and now in 2025, the authorization is for 100 million. Congress has supported this tremendously because they've seen the very positive of what's happened to the environmental effects. Next slide. So I want to show you what we've done and what the LTRM these UMRR projects through the long-term resource monitoring data. It's just a tremendous partnership we have. So this is Pool 13. This was the second project we did here. We did one in 1989 that was similar at Browns Lake, a little bit further up in Pool 13. But this is Lower Pool 13 around Thompson, Illinois. And so the lines that you see, the dark lines, we went in and excavated. This is similar to Beaver Island that was showing you earlier. This was a backwater complex that had completely silted in. Most of the water levels back in there was 6 inches to 12 inches. And so we created these deep water channels, excavated them down. They're 8 feet deep, they're 60 feet wide, they have a 3-to-1 side slope. And it's really to create a diversity of habitat. There was no diversity of habitat going back. And, you know, for fisheries in the wintertime, they require a certain amount of oxygen. They weren't getting that in 1 to 2 feet of water. We also created diversity of habitat. But what we did with this material, it was hauled up a little bit further north that you can't see, and there was a 31-acre moist soil impoundment. And so that moist soil impoundment has a pump station with it, so you can pump water into it, waterfowl can come into it, a little bit different diversity of vegetation. And there was also 17 potholes. 10 of those were blasted with dynamite, and 7 of them were excavated with mechanical equipment. So this is very typical of what we're doing in other areas, this excavation of backwater, really to create a diversity of habitat. And, you know, it's just, there's no way we can go in and completely restore these backwater lakes to the extent that they historically were there. Next slide. So we're moving downriver a little bit. This is still Pool 13, Pleasant Creek, a little north of there. So off to the left there, you can see the main river channel. This is, again, backwater lakes, floodplain areas. There's 6 backwater lakes in the Pleasant Creek area. And the area there you see in red and green, that was a moist soil unit that was created. And again, that was a little bit different habitat. This area floods every year. So as part of that moist soil unit, a well was installed. There was a water control structure installed. And what you see there in the middle is a concrete block mat spillway. So if you're familiar with spillways, they are typically 1 to 2 feet lower than the levee. And so when the floodwaters start to come in, they come across the spillway first with the hopes that the water levels are going to be equalized on the upside and the downside before the flood comes over the top of the earthen levee, and it reduces erosion. Next slide. I think we'll move down. This is Spring Lake. This is a very unique project also. What you see in red there, the Mississippi River channels off to the left, you can see the river miles. This was an old drainage district. You know, it was drained, levied in the 1920s, early 1930s, farmed for many, many decades. And in the lower right part of that, you can see where the river comes through, and it breached the levee many, many times. And the Corps of Engineers acquired it. We manage it for them under general plans land. So all of the area that you see within that red is a floodplain. There's 3 units in the top. There's a middle cross levee. And then the lower part, that 3,000 acres is open to the river. Extremely important area, not only from fisheries standpoint, but it's a migratory pathway. We get 40 to 50,000 birds that migrate through there. It's a sanctuary area that we have, so there's no hunting in it. So it's a very unique project. And under that HREP project, they completely restored the levee. Built a pump station in there and put water control structures in. So each one of these projects has a totally different objective typically. So this was an extremely important project as far as reestablishing that levee system. Next. We're moving down to Pool 14 now. This is Beaver Island right across from Clinton, Iowa. This is a 2,000-acre island, 1,600 acres of which is owned by the federal government, the Corps of Engineers primarily. So this was a little bit different project. This was primarily focused on forestry. So everything that you see in red there was forest restoration. Turned out to be about 1,200 acres, thousands of trees are in there. The lower part, the turquoise that you see down there, the light blue, that was excavation where we went in and excavated the backwater areas. Again, you can see the different lakes that were in there. And this was actually taken in the middle of there where it says Upper Lake. That's actually where that first aerial photo was taken, where the river was coming through and dumping all the sediment. And they said it used to be 10 feet deep. And we closed the main channel that heads to the north up there from Beaver Slough off to keep the river level from moving in there. The other part of the project is that you see Albany Island down there. It's right on the main channel. So we also worked on that. If you go to the next slide, show you a little bit more. So Albany Island, this is Beaver Island, I'll go back. So this is what they do when we go in and excavate the areas. So off to the right, this is kind of unique. I had not seen this before, but they brought barges in and they sunk them to the bottom, and the crane that you see on there, it excavates material off to the left, brings it over to the right, and it filled up. You can see them starting to fill the shoreline up. And they filled it all the way along that, and the lower right, that's the shoreline reestablished after they finished the project. So these are the operations during that time. Next slide, please. This is part of the forestry component. So the Corps foresters went in there, they surveyed the forest, did a tremendous amount of collection of information. They identified the highest quality trees that were in there, the stress trees, and focused on those. The area off to the right, you see, that's the embankment that I was showing in the slide before. Natural regeneration was fantastic. So, you don't get natural regeneration when you have the invasive plants that we talked about before. That does not happen. And other areas along the shoreline, you see the lower right where trees were planted. We ended up planting hundreds of trees. And this one, we put red flags on it because we learned a lesson a few years ago on Pool 12. The contractor was required to maintain the trees for 2 years. He hired a subcontractor to come in and mow in between the trees, and unfortunately didn't know the trees were there and mowed every single tree down. So we now put flags on them for subcontractors that may come in and not familiar with the project. Next slide. So this is Albany Island that was connected part of this project. And you can see the slides to the left this is right on the main channel. So like the shoreline erosion and the tree mortality that we see, this was protect against that. Wind and wave action, the barge action that you see. And then we put a chevron on the head of the island, north end of the island, because much of that island had eroded away. And you can actually see the aerial photograph of that. So trying to restore those islands, save those islands, again, with extreme floods that we're seeing, the duration of these and the high winds combined with it, we're losing many of our islands on the river. Next slide. We're down in Pool 14 now with a similar project to what we did up at Beaver Island. This is down by Princeton, Iowa. So it's very similar. Steamboat Island is the project down there now, and you can see in the upper right, once again, we put a rock chevron on, which is large boulders. And one of the things I didn't mention is in certain areas, we put smaller stone to mix in with that riprap to encourage mussels, and it's been very productive in doing that. But once again, this is very typical of what we're trying to do to restore these islands that we're losing so much of them due to erosion. In this project, we're going to fill in everything behind the rock chevrons. It's about 14 acres, and it'll be a little bit higher in topography, and we'll be able to plant trees on it. Next slide. So, the other projects have been pretty easy to figure out what you want to do. An island's eroding, a backwater lake is sediment in. This is lower Pool 13. And what you can see in the bottom that's Lock and Dam 13 that you see in the lower part. And this is 5 miles across. And the gray line that you see going down is the main river channel. It's all open area. The shadows that you see, the green shadows in the dark, are submergent vegetation in there. So we decided there's going to be several phases to this project, but we had to figure out what we wanted to do, like Jeff talked about. When you have wide open areas like that, you have a lot of wind and wave action. There's constant sediment, very poor quality, water quality, and no vegetation. So we had vegetation here. So our planning team has been working over 2 years to figure out what to do here. We decided to focus on the southwest corner of that open area. And so if you go to the next slide, and we use a tremendous amount of data here. LTRM's been down there doing the vegetation transects that Jeff talked about. They were doing flow distribution to figure out, where was the biggest flows coming from. Right now, there's a project going down there now where they've got radar, and they're monitoring wind, and they also have sensors under the water, and they're actually measuring wave action. So I think what's so unique about this is, this is a tremendously large project that we're hoping to do good things, and they're collecting a tremendous amount of information ahead of time. And then we're going to go back and see if what we did actually worked. So the next slide, please. So this is what our draft phase 1 is going to look like. Is we're going to go in and we're going to put rock chevrons in this area with the goal to slow some of that current down, to slow some of the sedimentation down. And typically what we do is when we see that, we get vegetation that forms behind that. So again, these will be rock chevrons. The one in yellow is a little bit larger island, but there won't be any trees or anything planted on. These are strictly be rock chevrons. The main thing is that area is so important for canvasbacks, which feed on the submergent vegetation that we see down there. So we didn't want to create any islands. We didn't want to create anything that would really stick above the water line. So if you go to the next slide, it kind of show you just what a similar project downriver. So that's the large rock chevrons that we'll be placing in lower pool 13. This is just a similar project. This is not pool 13, but they'll be placed down there. They're used in many different, in this case, it's used to keep the flow to the channel. And last slide, I believe. So just to show you how fortunate that we have been as far as this habitat rehabilitation enhancement projects going and the partnership, because we're federal lands, everything is paid for by the Corps of Engineers, and we have been extremely fortunate. Again, I've never worked with any partnership like this, but we've completed 6 projects just in pools 12, 13, and 14. We've improved over 15,000 acres of the river. And there's been almost $52 million spent. Right now, we have 3 projects that are in progress, and they're valued at over 100 million, the estimated cost. We've still got future projects coming up in the future, so it's just incredible. I have to tell you that I'm working 47 years now because of this program. It really is. I've never seen anything like this, and it's hard to imagine what the river would be like without this program. Just incredible, and I hope there's great awareness by the public of this. I think we need to really do the happy dance for it. So, thank you very much. That's mine.
Wow. Well, Ed and Jeff, thank you so much for providing that information. That was an incredible webinar. I'm gonna have to watch this one back a couple times to keep soaking in the information. I know we're getting down to the end of the hour here. There are a couple questions that have come in through the chat. And let's start with this one. Kristen asks, how do you track and communicate the physical results and successes of the money invested?
I think that's either a good question for Ed or maybe for Davey. If neither one of them wants to tackle it, I can give it a shot, but that's more in there.
Actually, we have the regional program manager on the call today. He might want to tackle that one. I threw you under the bus, Marshall. So, short answer to that question, we have a coordinating committee, and we engage at the highest levels of command, and we have congressional visits that we host every year to Congress, and we have to report out on all of these projects and how much they cost and what the benefits are for each one of these projects at the highest levels in Washington, D.C. So that's the short answer.
Yeah, and we do every so many years, we have a whole team that goes out and looks at them and analyzes and describes what it is. And one of the things, as we take on these projects, the Fish and Wildlife Service, we're required for long-term maintenance of these projects. So, you know, we have a vested interest also in these to make sure that they are successful.
Another question: in the face of the changing, I mean, the climate change is here, right? We know the climate is changing. How is that impacting the cost of these rehabilitation and monitoring programs?
I think for the monitoring, I don't think it has much of an effect on the cost. It definitely affects the logistics to some extent. Especially the warmer winters with the sketchier ice, because we have, for water quality, we send winter crews out, and in the upper, like pool 4, pool 8, and pool 13, historically have had solid ice for them to work on. And now it's often partially ice. And so that presents all sorts of challenges.
Yeah, I think we're seeing increased degradation. You know, we're seeing much more tree mortality. We're seeing much more sedimentation. So these smaller projects that we did in the past, now we have to focus on these much larger projects. I mean, particularly when you're looking at something like the Lower Pool 13 project, where you've got an entire area you're trying to address that, you know, when the lock and dam system came about, that whole area was forest and prairie and now we're trying to restore that somewhat, you know, within the confines of a lock and dam system.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff and Ed. A follow-up related to this from Danielle: how does this work need to scale up to keep pace with environmental damage / degradation?
Well, I think that part of the answer to that is we have to be very strategic about what we do, because we can probably only address a subset of the challenges at any given time. And so one of the things that the program does is to think pretty hard about, you know, which projects to move forward and when, in terms of trying to focus on areas where they can have the most impact.
I will also say that the program is in the process of updating their 10-year strategic plan, and those are the types of issues that we discussed during that development as well. And then also you saw in Ed's earlier slide about the increases in authorized funding that have gone on over the past several years, and we're starting to see a little bit of that recognition of as environmental degradation continues to occur because of the river's multiple uses, there are going to be greater investments in restoring the river. Over.
Yeah, one of the things we're doing now, you know, like that devastation of the forest, where the Corps has gone in with their forestry program and surveyed it and, you know, picked the areas of highest quality forestry and then the areas that are stressed and the areas that are completely doomed. And so these projects try to focus on the areas with highest quality first, try and save what we have out there, and then go into the areas that are stressed. And then at some point, hopefully in the future, we can address these other areas too. But yeah, trying to prioritize what's out there is so important right now with so much of the challenges to address.
Yeah, and I guess I want to add one other comment there. A lot of what we're addressing within this program, because we're restricted to working in the river and the floodplain. So we're sort of addressing symptoms that are the result of, in many cases, at least some of which are the result of what's going on up in the watershed. And so part of what needs to happen is also ongoing and continued improvements in land use and land management. To help with things like nutrient input and sediment input, because all of that is connected. And so one of the things we are are working toward is to be better connected with some of the groups that do direct work in those areas. And then I saw a nitrogen question that I'll just tackle very briefly. My understanding is most of the nitrogen regulations are related around essentially drinking water acute toxicity for people. And so I think those are often around 10 milligrams per liter or something. I'm a little bit out of date on this, but that was the case until fairly recently. And that's really, really high nitrogen from an ecological perspective. So there's not, at least in a lot of places, a tight regulation of nitrogen in surface waters.
Wonderful. My friends, I'm noticing the time and I want to be respectful here and get everyone on with their day for, respect the time that you have committed to. Davey, thank you so much for answering questions in the chat as we have been going. I saw a question in there, Stephen, about the carp. That was covered in the slide, so please check the recording. The recording will go out to everyone that has registered. And if it's okay, Jeff and Ed will close with one final question from Dean Klinkenberg. Do you have a ballpark estimate of the number of acres of island habitat that have been lost?
I don't have one off the top of my head. I might be able to find one. And Dean, I've talked to you before, so I might be able to catch up with you later.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I can tell you that islands are completely gone. You know, it's kind of interesting on the steamboat project. We had the southeast island and we were going to put a rock chevron in. By the time we actually got to doing the project, the island was completely gone. And that's within 4 years.
Dean said thanks in the chat. I hope you all saw that. Well, speaking of thanks, Ed, Jeff, Davey, as well as the chat, and many other partners that have helped make this webinar possible. The praise is coming into the chat. Hope you all see that. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. As mentioned, this could have been a week-long workshop. So, hey, if folks have, specific sort of channels that they want to learn more about or topics, reach out. Okay, we'll be sending out a follow-up email that has a bunch of resources and links. Feel free to reply to that. And maybe this webinar, maybe this becomes a series, all right, of different topics we can go into. So,
and you could put my email in that too if you want to directly contact me with questions. That'd be fine.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Jeff. Okay, with that, we'll shut it down. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.